The first time Daniel Carter noticed the two figures behind the market stalls, he thought they were just stray children, thin, silent, and trying desperately not to be seen. But something about the way they moved, the way their eyes reflected light even in the dim corners of the alley, made him pause mid-step, his grocery bag shifting in his hand as his instincts told him this was no ordinary situation. And when the smaller of the two let out a faint, almost broken whisper, "Food!" his heart tightened in a way he couldn't ignore. Daniel wasn't a wealthy man. He worked long hours, raising his young daughter alone after life had taken more than it had given, and every coin he spent mattered, every meal was planned carefully. But none of that mattered in that moment as he turned slowly and looked directly at them. Really looked this time and realized the truth. They weren't human. Their features were subtle enough that most would miss it. A slight shimmer beneath their skin, eyes too bright, too sharp, and the faintest outline of scales along their necks and arms. But to Daniel, who had seen enough of the world to recognize something extraordinary when it stood in front of him, it was clear. Dragonkin, young ones, starving, and alone. The taller of the two, clearly the elder, instinctively stepped in front of the smaller, its posture defensive despite its obvious weakness, its voice trembling but trying to sound firm. "We not trouble," it said, each word forced through exhaustion. "We just go." Daniel slowly set his grocery bag down, raising one hand in a calm, non-threatening gesture. "Hey," he said gently, "it's all right. I'm not here to chase you off." The smaller one peeked from behind the other, its eyes wide and hollow with hunger. Its lips parted as if it wanted to speak again but didn't have the strength. Daniel's chest tightened further. He had seen hunger before, real hunger, the kind that wasn't just about missing a meal but about survival slipping through your fingers. And this was it. There was no hesitation left in him. "Have you eaten today?" he asked softly. They didn't answer. They didn't need to. Daniel exhaled slowly, glancing briefly at the groceries he had just bought. Carefully chosen, budgeted, meant to last the week, and then back at the two starving dragon princes standing in front of him, barely able to remain upright. "All right," he said, his voice steady now. "Come with me." The elder's eyes narrowed slightly, suspicion flickering despite the desperation. "Why?" it asked. Daniel didn't sugarcoat it. "Because you're hungry," he replied simply. "And I can fix that." There was a long pause. The alley seemed to hold its breath. Then the smaller one whispered again, weaker this time. "Please." That was enough. The elder hesitated only a second longer before nodding once. Daniel picked up his bag and turned, walking at a steady pace, not looking back to see if they followed. But he could hear their footsteps, uneven and light, trailing behind him. The walk home wasn't long, but to the two starving princes, it felt endless. They stumbled more than once, their strength barely holding, but they didn't stop. They couldn't. The promise of food, of relief, pulled them forward like the last thread of hope they had left. When Daniel reached his small house, he pushed the door open and stepped inside, immediately greeted by the warm, familiar voice of his daughter from the other room. "Dad? You're back." "Yeah," he called out. "And we've got guests." There was a brief silence, then quick footsteps as a young girl appeared in the doorway, her curious eyes widening the moment she saw the two figures standing hesitantly behind him. She took in their thin frames, their trembling posture, and whatever questions she had faded instantly into understanding far beyond her years. "They're hungry," she said softly. Daniel nodded once. "Yeah." She didn't hesitate. "I'll help," she said, already moving toward the kitchen. The two dragon princes stood frozen near the door, clearly unsure if they were truly allowed to enter, their instincts battling between caution and desperation. Daniel noticed immediately. "Hey," he said gently, "you're safe here. Come in." Slowly, cautiously, they stepped inside. The warmth hit them first. Then the smell. Food. Real food. The smaller one swayed slightly, its body reacting before its mind could, and Daniel moved quickly, guiding it toward a chair. "Easy," he said. "You're all right." The elder followed closely, still watching everything, still wary. But the edge of fear was beginning to crack under the weight of something it hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. In the kitchen, Daniel and his daughter worked quickly, turning simple ingredients into something more. Something warm, filling, real. It wasn't a feast. It wasn't extravagant. But it was made with care, with urgency, with understanding. When the plates were finally set on the table, the two princes stared at them as if they weren't real. "Go on," Daniel said softly. "Eat." For a second, neither of them moved. Then the smaller one reached out, its hand trembling, and took the first bite. Everything changed. His eyes widened, not just from the taste, but from what it meant. Warmth spread through its body, strength returning in small, fragile waves. A soft, broken sound escaped it. Not quite a cry, not quite a laugh. The elder followed, slower at first, then with growing urgency as the reality set in. They ate, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they weren't starving anymore. Dragon. For a long time after the first bite, there were no words at the table, only the quiet, desperate rhythm of eating as the two dragon princes devoured the meal placed before them, not with greed, but with the kind of urgency that came from having gone too long without anything at all, their hands trembling less with each passing moment as warmth slowly returned to their bodies, and Daniel Carter sat across from them in silence, watching carefully, not to judge or rush them, but to make sure they didn't eat too fast and hurt themselves, while his daughter moved quietly beside him, refilling water, placing more food when needed, her small face serious in a way that showed she understood exactly how important this moment was. The younger prince was the first to slow down, his movements becoming hesitant as his hunger began to ease. His wide eyes lifting toward Daniel as if trying to understand something that didn't make sense to him. "Why?" he asked softly, his voice still weak but clearer than before. Daniel leaned back slightly, folding his arms loosely. "Because you needed it," he said simply. The older prince stiffened at that answer, his gaze narrowing just a little, suspicion not fully gone even now. "Nothing free," he said carefully, each word chosen with effort. "People take later." His tone wasn't accusing, it was cautious, shaped by experience. Daniel met his gaze without flinching. "Not here," he replied. "You don't owe me anything." There was a pause, a long one. The younger prince looked between them, clearly unsure, then spoke again. "Food, real," he whispered, almost like he needed to confirm it. Daniel's daughter gave a small, warm smile. "Yeah," she said gently. "Real food. You can have more if you want." The younger prince blinked, then looked down at the plate again, as if it might disappear if he looked away too long. "More allowed?" he asked quietly. Daniel felt something twist in his chest at that. "Yeah," he said, his voice softer now. "More is allowed." That was all it took. The tension in the room shifted again. Not gone, but easing, like a tight knot beginning to loosen. The older prince finally exhaled, the rigid line of his shoulders dropping just slightly as he reached for another piece of bread. Slower this time, more controlled, but no less grateful. As the meal continued, the two princes began to regain not just their strength, but their voices. The younger one spoke first, hesitantly. "We walk long," he said, glancing at Daniel. "No food many days." His small hands tightened slightly around the edge of the table. "People see run away." Daniel nodded slowly. He wasn't surprised. Fear of dragonkind still ran deep in many places, especially when they were vulnerable. It made people unpredictable. "What about your home?" he asked carefully. "Your family?" The question changed everything. The older prince went still, completely still. The younger one's expression faltered, his eyes dropping as the faintest shimmer of emotion passed across his face. "Gone," he said softly. Daniel didn't press further. He didn't need to. Silence settled over the table again, heavier this time, but not empty. Carried understanding, respect. After a while, Daniel's daughter spoke gently, trying to ease the weight. "Do you have names?" she asked. The younger prince looked up, blinking. "Name?" he repeated, as if the word itself felt distant. The older one answered this time, though his voice was quieter than before. "We had," he said, "but No one uses now. Daniel exchanged a brief glance with his daughter. That was more than just losing a name. That was losing identity. Belonging. Well, Daniel said slowly, choosing his words with care. If you want, you can still use them here. The older prince hesitated. For a long moment it looked like he might refuse. Then, quietly, almost reluctantly, he spoke. Kale. He nodded slightly toward himself. Then, after a brief pause, he gestured to the younger one. Rin. The younger prince, Rin, looked up, a small spark returning to his eyes at hearing his name spoken aloud again. Rin, he repeated softly. Daniel smiled faintly. Kale. Rin. Good names. His daughter beamed a little. I like them, she added. Something shifted again. Subtle, but real. For the first time since they had entered the house, the two princes didn't look like strangers passing through. They looked seen. The rest of the evening passed more gently. After they finished eating, Daniel guided them to sit back and rest, making sure they didn't overexert themselves too quickly. Rin nearly fell asleep right there at the table, his body finally giving in now that it no longer had to fight just to stay awake. Kale caught him before he slipped, steadying him instinctively, though his own strength was still returning. You can rest, Daniel said quietly. No one's going to make you leave. Kale looked at him sharply, searching his face for any sign of deception. But there was none, just quiet certainty. Why? Kale asked again, more softly this time. Daniel thought for a moment, then gave a simple answer. Because someone should have helped you sooner. That seemed to reach him in a way nothing else had. Kale didn't reply, but he didn't argue either. That night, Daniel set up a small space for them in the living room. Nothing fancy, just blankets, pillows, and warmth. But to the two princes, it might as well have been a palace. Rin curled up almost immediately, his breathing deep and steady within minutes. Kale remained awake longer, sitting quietly, watching everything, still not fully letting his guard down. Daniel paused in the doorway before heading to his own room. You're safe here, he said one last time. Kale didn't respond right away, but as Daniel turned to leave, a quiet voice followed him. Thank you. He stopped but didn't turn around. You're welcome, he said, just as quietly. And for the first time in a very long time, the house didn't just feel like a place to survive. Felt like something more. Morning came softly, sunlight slipping through the thin curtains and spreading warmth across the small living room where Kale and Rin slept. Their bodies curled into the blankets as if still unsure whether the comfort surrounding them was real or something that might vanish if they moved too quickly. And for a long while, Daniel Carter stood in the doorway, quietly watching, arms folded. His expression thoughtful as he took in the sight of the two dragon princes finally at rest. Not tense, not starving, not afraid, at least not in that moment. And something inside him settled in a way he hadn't expected. A quiet certainty that whatever this was, whatever responsibility he had stepped into, he wasn't going to walk away from it. In the kitchen, his daughter was already awake, carefully preparing a simple breakfast, her movements gentle so as not to disturb their guests. They're still sleeping? She asked in a soft voice. Daniel nodded. Yeah, let them. They need it. She smiled faintly. They looked really tired. They were, Daniel replied. It wasn't long before the smell of food began to fill the house again. And that was what finally stirred Rin first. The younger prince shifted slightly, his nose twitching before his eyes slowly opened, blinking against the light as confusion flickered across his face. Then recognition followed, and with it something softer. Warm, he murmured, almost to himself. He sat up slowly, looking around as if expecting the room to disappear, then spotted Daniel standing nearby. Still here, he said, his voice quiet but filled with a strange kind of relief. Daniel gave a small nod. Told you. Rin smiled just a little, but it was there. Kale woke moments later, far more alert, his eyes opening sharply as his body tensed out of instinct before quickly assessing the situation again. His gaze landing on Daniel, then the room, then his brother. When he saw that nothing had changed, that they were still safe, some of that tension eased, though not completely. Morning, he said cautiously. Morning, Daniel replied. There's food again. That got their attention immediately. This time, they didn't hesitate as much. They moved to the table slowly, still careful, but not afraid, their steps steadier than the night before. As they sat down, Rin glanced at the food, then at Daniel. "More allowed?" he asked, the same question as before, but with a little less uncertainty now. Daniel smiled faintly. "Always." They ate more calmly this time. Not the desperate urgency of the night before, but a controlled hunger, their bodies beginning to trust that the food wouldn't disappear. Between bites, Rin looked around the house with open curiosity, while Kale remained more reserved, though his constant scanning of exits and corners had lessened slightly. After a while, Daniel leaned back in his chair. "You can't stay hidden forever," he said gently, not as a threat, but as a truth. Kale's movements slowed. "We know," he replied quietly. Rin looked between them, confused. "Hide bad." Daniel shook his head. "Not bad, just not safe forever." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The people who ignored you before, not all of them will ignore you next time." That much Kale understood immediately. His jaw tightened slightly. "We keep moving," he said. "We always have." Daniel nodded slowly. "And has it worked?" That question hung in the air. Kale didn't answer. Rin lowered his gaze. After a moment, Daniel continued, his voice calm but firm. "Running keeps you alive, but it doesn't give you a life." Kale's eyes flickered toward him, something shifting behind them. Resistance? Maybe, or the beginning of doubt. "You don't have to decide anything right now," Daniel added. "But staying here, even for a little while, it's an option." Silence followed. Rin looked up first, his voice small but hopeful. "Stay here?" Kale closed his eyes briefly, as if weighing something heavy, something far beyond the moment. When he opened them again, he looked directly at Daniel. "For now," he said. That was enough. The rest of the day unfolded differently from the one before. Instead of just recovering, the two princes began to exist within the space. Slowly, cautiously, but undeniably. Rin followed Daniel's daughter around, asking simple questions, repeating words, his natural curiosity beginning to bloom now that survival wasn't his only focus. "This what?" he asked, pointing at everyday objects, learning quickly, absorbing everything. Kale stayed closer to Daniel, observing more than speaking, but eventually even he began to ask questions, practical ones. "Work?" he asked at one point, watching Daniel fix a broken hinge. "Yeah," Daniel replied, "fixing things. It's what I do." Kale nodded slowly. "Fix life?" he asked quietly, almost under his breath. Daniel paused. Then, after a moment, he gave a small, honest answer. "Trying to." That seemed to stay with him. As evening approached, something subtle but important had changed. The house no longer felt like a temporary refuge. It felt lived in, shared. Rin laughed for the first time. A soft, surprised sound when Daniel's daughter showed him something simple and playful. Kale didn't laugh, but the hardness in his expression had eased, replaced by something steadier. At dinner, Rin looked up suddenly. "We not starving now," he said, as if realizing it fully for the first time. Daniel smiled faintly. "No," he said. "You're not." Rin nodded, then added quietly, "Hope back." The word hung there. Hope. Kale glanced at his brother, then at Daniel. He didn't say anything, but he didn't look away either. And for the first time since they had lost everything, neither of them felt alone anymore. Dragon. The following morning brought a quiet determination with it, the sunlight filtering softly through the curtains of Daniel Carter's modest home, casting a warm glow over the small kitchen where Rin and Kale sat together. Their postures slightly more relaxed than before, but still alert, still measuring every sound and movement as if the world might turn against them at any moment. And Daniel watched them with a careful patience, understanding that trust, once broken, took far longer to rebuild than strength, and that these two young dragon princes carried scars deeper than the eye could see, invisible but no less real. He had spent the previous day preparing for this moment, planning meals that were easy to digest but nourishing, making sure there were enough blankets for them to sleep comfortably, and arranging the living space so that they could feel some measure of control over their environment, a luxury they had never truly known. "Eat slowly," he instructed softly, setting plates of steaming food in front of them. "And take your time. There's no rush here." Rin's small claws reached for the food tentatively, while Kale's gaze swept over the table, assessing every item, calculating if any posed a threat, as though Daniel himself might vanish if he turned his eyes away. For the first time since they had arrived, the air between them wasn't dominated by fear or hunger. It carried the tentative tension of something unfamiliar. Comfort. As Rin took the first cautious bites, his eyes widening with each taste, Daniel caught the subtle twitch of delight on Kale's face, so faint that anyone else might have missed it, and he realized that even Kale, whose caution had always been sharper, whose instincts were honed from constant survival, was beginning to relax, if only fractionally. The two princes ate quietly at first, each lost in their own thoughts, but gradually, as the warmth of the food seeped through their bodies, the silence became more natural, punctuated by small, careful observations from Rin, questions whispered from Kale, and the soft hum of a household settling into routine. Daniel and his daughter moved with quiet efficiency, topping up their water, offering seconds, creating a rhythm that allowed the young dragons to focus solely on something they had almost forgotten. Feeling safe. "More?" Daniel asked, offering a plate to Rin. The younger prince hesitated, blinking, as if the concept of having enough food was almost incomprehensible, before nodding slowly. "Yes, please," he murmured. Kale watched, then mirrored his brother, more reserved but no less appreciative. That small exchange marked a shift, subtle but profound, because it was the first moment in a long time that they weren't negotiating survival, weren't calculating fear, weren't expecting betrayal. They were simply receiving, and beginning to understand that there were people who would give without expecting anything in return. After the meal, Daniel guided them to a small clearing of the living room, blankets and cushions laid out for rest. Rin collapsed immediately, his body finally succumbing to exhaustion, curling into a tight ball, as if trying to contain all the pent-up fear and hunger he had carried for weeks. Kale remained upright, vigilant at first, but gradually his shoulders relaxed, and he allowed himself to sit against the wall, eyes flicking to Daniel occasionally, measuring, learning, but no longer preparing for escape. "You're safe here," Daniel said softly, kneeling to meet Kale's gaze. "No one is going to take you away, and no one's going to hurt you." Kale's expression remained stoic, but the edge of tension in his posture softened slightly. The day stretched on, and slowly, subtly, their small world began to change. Daniel introduced them to simple tasks around the house. Fetching small items, helping to tidy, observing the way life worked in this human home, and with each task, Kale and Rin learned something new about trust, about order, about the comfort that came from knowing someone cared enough to include them. Daniel's daughter laughed quietly as Rin asked endless questions about ordinary objects, his eyes alight with curiosity for the first time in years. Kale's attention was more deliberate, but he too began to ask questions, practical ones, probing the world around him with a growing understanding that there could be stability, that not all people were threats. By evening, the two princes had begun to talk. Not freely, not yet, but enough to allow glimpses of their personalities to emerge. Rin's voice carried a softness, a curiosity, a spark of hope, while Kale's tone remained measured, deliberate, but tinged with the faintest thread of cautious humor that Daniel detected and silently celebrated. The bond between them and Daniel grew quietly, anchored in simple, deliberate acts, preparing food, guiding them gently, answering questions with patience, and, above all, providing safety where none had existed for a long, painful time. Night fell, and Daniel prepared for bed, making sure the dragon princes were tucked in comfortably. Rin drifted off quickly, his small body finally allowing the vulnerability he had been forced to deny. Kale remained awake longer, his eyes tracing the room, the walls, Daniel's face, as if cataloging every detail for potential threats. Yet even he relaxed slowly, the tension in his muscles easing as the steady presence of Daniel reassured him. Daniel knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on Kale's shoulder. "Rest," he said softly. "You're safe here." We'll face whatever comes tomorrow together. Kale's eyes flickered, the faintest acknowledgement of trust passing across them before he settled down beside his brother. As Daniel moved to his own room, he felt a quiet shift in the house. A subtle change that indicated these two young dragon princes were beginning to accept more than food and shelter. They were beginning to accept care. And in that acceptance lay something extraordinary. The tentative rebuilding of hope. For the first time in what had been an endless stretch of fear and hunger, Kale and Rin allowed themselves to imagine a future where survival wasn't the only measure of life. In the darkness, Rin whispered softly in his sleep, "Safe." Kale's tail curled slightly closer to his brother, a protective gesture without tension, almost instinctively shared, and Daniel paused at the doorway, listening. Yes, he thought quietly to himself. They were safe, for now. And that safety, hard-won, fragile but real, would be the foundation of something stronger. Because tomorrow and every day after that, Daniel Carter would feed more than their bodies. He would feed their hope, their courage, and their trust. And in doing so, he would teach them something that no starvation, no fear, no fleeing ever could. That there was a place in the world where they truly belonged. Dragon. The next morning broke with a quiet, deliberate stillness, the kind of calm that carries a subtle promise of change, and Daniel Carter found himself awake before anyone else, moving through the house with careful precision as he prepared breakfast, listening to the faint, uneven breathing of Rin and Kale in the other room and marveling at how different the scene had become from the one when he had first brought them inside. Then, they had been hollow-eyed, trembling with hunger and mistrust, clinging to the edge of survival like it was all they had. But now, even in sleep, their bodies spoke of strength slowly returning, of muscles relaxing, of bones no longer screaming with deprivation. Daniel's daughter stirred as he moved past the kitchen doorway, blinking sleepily at the smell of cooking. "They're eating well?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Better than they've eaten in weeks. And more than that," he added quietly. "They're beginning to feel like they belong here." She smiled faintly, a mix of pride and relief lighting her young face. When he called them to the table, Rin appeared first, wobbling slightly on unsteady legs but moving with a certainty that had been absent before, his small hands reaching eagerly for the plate of steaming food. Kale followed more deliberately, scanning the surroundings as always, but the tension that had gripped him like armor was softer now, more measured, less defensive. The moment they began eating, Daniel noticed the subtle changes. The way Rin's eyes brightened as warmth spread through his body, the careful attention Kale paid to every bite without the shadow of desperation that had marked his every movement before. They were learning again what it meant to be fed, not just for survival but for nourishment, for comfort. As they ate, Daniel allowed himself to speak gently, not asking questions that might provoke suspicion, not pressing for answers, but guiding them toward understanding through conversation and patience. "You don't have to hide here," he said quietly. "This place is safe." Kale's eyes flicked to him, guarded, measuring, as if weighing the truth of the words, while Rin looked up with wide, innocent hope. "Safe?" Rin asked softly. Daniel nodded. "Yes, no one will hurt you here. No one will chase you away." The words seemed to settle over them, sinking slowly into their awareness. For the first time in an uncountable number of days, they felt the absence of fear. Not entirely, but enough to breathe without instinctive tension. Kale's jaw loosened slightly, his posture easing fractionally, while Rin's small body relaxed, the hunger-driven rigidity melting into a rare comfort. Daniel's daughter moved beside him, refilling cups of water, gently placing extra food on their plates, and the scene unfolded with a soft, domestic rhythm that contrasted sharply with the harsh, brutal world outside. After breakfast, Daniel decided to begin the next step in their slow recovery, teaching them the simplest routines of a safe, structured life. He showed them how to help with small chores, tidying the living room, clearing dishes, even simple tasks in the garden outside, allowing them to feel useful, allowing them to exercise control over a part of their world that had previously been dominated by unpredictability and fear. Rin responded immediately, eager and attentive, while Kale approached each task cautiously, his movements precise, his mind clearly analyzing and cataloging every detail before committing. Watching them, Daniel realized that trust wasn't just given. It was built, brick by careful brick, and these two princes were beginning to lay their foundation. As the hours passed, the two young dragons began to talk more openly. Rin asked countless questions, his curiosity bubbling forth with an almost childlike exuberance, while Kale's voice, reserved at first, emerged in measured tones, offering insights, seeking explanations, showing that intelligence and caution could coexist with the faintest hints of growing comfort. Daniel answered patiently, never rushing, never forcing, allowing them to explore the limits of their newfound safety at their own pace. Every answer, every gentle guidance, became another thread weaving trust into the fabric of their relationship. By midday, the household had taken on a sense of quiet order, a rhythm that resonated with both human and dragon. Daniel and his daughter worked together seamlessly, Rin assisting with small, eager hands and Kale observing, stepping in only when necessary, his analytical mind absorbing patterns, routines, and gestures like a sponge. It was a delicate balance, the younger prince's warmth and curiosity offsetting the elder's cautious intelligence. But together, they created a harmony that spoke of something far deeper than food or shelter. The beginnings of a family, of connection, of belonging. When the afternoon arrived, Daniel brought out a small collection of books, reading to them slowly, allowing the dragons to hear stories and concepts they had never encountered before, filling the silence with ideas and imagination rather than fear and hunger. Rin leaned forward, eyes wide, absorbing every word, while Kale's attention was more measured, yet no less captivated, his tail curling slightly as he listened, his posture softened, his mind beginning to accept that knowledge could exist alongside safety. The simple act of reading together, sharing stories, brought them closer, bridging the gap between caution and trust, fear and hope. Evening approached, and Daniel prepared a simple dinner, the aroma once again filling the house, wrapping around the small dragons like an invisible shield. As they ate, conversation flowed naturally now. Small, tentative exchanges that carried laughter, curiosity, and the first real moments of connection. Rin laughed openly at a small story, his tiny claws clapping together, while Kale's dry, subtle smile emerged when Daniel described a mishap from his own childhood. The sight was extraordinary to witness. Two young dragon princes, once hollowed out by hunger and fear, now experiencing joy in simple, ordinary life. After dinner, Daniel led them outside for fresh air, a chance to stretch, to explore the small garden that bordered the property, the twilight sky casting a soft glow over everything. Rin ran ahead, exploring with eager curiosity, while Kale stayed close to Daniel, his head turning to observe every movement, every sound, still cautious but visibly more at ease. The bond between human and dragon, fragile yet undeniable, strengthened with every shared glance, every guiding hand, every moment of mutual understanding. As night fell, Daniel prepared their sleeping area once again, blankets arranged, small comforts in place, and the dragons settled down, Rin curling against his brother, Kale's protective instincts quietly surfacing even in relaxation. Daniel knelt beside them, placing a steadying hand on Kale's shoulder. "Rest," he said softly. "You're safe here. We'll face the world together tomorrow." Kale's eyes flickered with acknowledgement, a rare trust that had taken so long to earn, and then he finally allowed himself to lie down, his gaze softening as he looked at Rin and then at Daniel. The house was quiet now, but the quiet was alive with possibility. No longer just a refuge from starvation and fear, it had become a place of healing, a place where hope could take root, where the small acts of kindness and care could begin to reshape broken lives. Daniel lingered in the doorway for a long moment, watching them breathe, feeling the profound responsibility and the extraordinary privilege of being their caretaker, protector, and guide. In the darkness, he whispered softly to himself, "We'll see this through." And as the stars shone faintly through the windows, the dragon princes slept, their bodies finally at rest, their minds opening to the rare, almost unbelievable notion that someone, just one human, had changed everything for them, simply by feeding them, simply by caring, simply by believing in them when no one else had. The smallest gestures had become the foundation of trust. The simplest meal had become the beginning of hope. And in the quiet night, Daniel Carter realized that this fragile, extraordinary bond between human and dragon was not just survival. It was life in its most profound, most transformative form. Dragon,